The helicopter banked hard over the ridgeline, and Captain Claire Anderson gripped the strap above her seat as the valley floor tilted into view. Through the scratched window, she caught her first look at Forward Operating Base Kestrel, a collection of low buildings and reinforced tents pressed into a fold of mountain terrain, connected to the rest of the world by a single dirt road, and, she now saw, a bridge that looked smaller and older than anything in her briefing photos. She'd read the file twice on the flight over. Water tower showing signs of stress. Generator housing in need of structural assessment. Supply bridge. Monitor only, prior engineer's note had said, which in Claire's experience was military shorthand for nobody's fixed this yet, and nobody wants to be the one who has to. She'd expected something else when her orders came through. A training assignment, maybe, or a desk in Bagram reviewing blueprints for a base that already worked. Instead, she'd gotten 6 weeks at the edge of nowhere, attached to a unit that didn't know her and wouldn't, she suspected, particularly want to. The helicopter set down hard enough to rattle her teeth, and she stepped out into wind that smelled like dust and diesel. A soldier was waiting to walk her in, but it was Major Holt who met her at the operations tent, already mid-conversation with someone else, a radio handset pressed to his shoulder. He held up one finger to her, "Wait," and finished giving instructions about a fuel delivery before he turned. "Captain Anderson." He shook her hand once, efficient. "They told us Corps of Engineers was sending someone. Didn't expect it this fast." "I was told this was urgent, sir. Everything out here is urgent." He said it without bitterness, just exhaustion worn smooth by repetition. "We've got a water tower that drips more than it should, a generator that's older than some of my soldiers, and a bridge that's the only way anything gets in or out of this valley. Pick your crisis. I'd like to see all three, today, if possible." That got a flicker of something from him. Surprise, maybe, or the first hint of reassessment. Most people want to see their quarters first. "My quarters aren't going to fall down on someone, sir." Holt almost smiled. Almost. He pointed her toward the supply NCO to get her gear stowed and told her someone would walk her out to the bridge before dark. She spent the afternoon on the water tower first, climbing the access ladder with a flashlight clipped to her vest, running her hand along welds that had been patched more than once. The corrosion was worse near the base than the maintenance logs suggested. Not surprising exactly, but not nothing either. She made notes. She always made notes, meticulous ones. The kind of documentation that had once been called excessive by a battalion commander who'd later been very glad she had it. She didn't let herself think about that project. Not directly. It surfaced anyway, the way it always did when she stood somewhere with structural weight bearing down and people depending on her judgment. A training facility 2 years ago. A beam she'd cleared that shouldn't have been cleared. A soldier named Davis who'd ended up with a shattered leg in a fall that an investigation later determined wasn't her fault. Not her fault. She'd had that confirmed in writing. It hadn't made the months afterward any easier, and it hadn't stopped her from triple-checking every load calculation she'd made since. She climbed down from the tower as the light started going gold and long across the valley, and asked for the bridge. It was smaller in person than the photographs had made it look, and somehow that made it worse. A single lane crossing over a river that ran shallow now but wouldn't always. Support beams that had clearly been reinforced at some point by someone working with whatever materials were on hand. Claire walked the length of it slowly, the boards giving slightly under her boots in a way that made the back of her neck prickle. She crouched at the second support beam from the east bank and found the crack the prior engineer's notes had mentioned. It was longer than logged, not by a dramatic amount. She wasn't the type to dramatize a number, but enough that she pulled out her notebook and did the math twice, standing there in the cooling air with her flashlight angled against the metal. The bridge had been rated for a certain load. The crack changed that rating. Not catastrophically. Not yet. But the gap between what this bridge can hold and what command probably assumes it can hold was wider than she liked. And she had learned the hard way that gaps like that didn't stay quiet forever. She stayed crouched there until the light went fully out of the sky, the river moving steady and indifferent beneath her, and somewhere behind her the base hummed on with its generator and its routines, unaware yet of exactly what she'd found. She closed her notebook, stood, and started back toward the lights, already composing the report in her head, and already knowing that whatever she wrote, getting anyone to act on it in time, was going to be its own kind of fight. By her third day at Kestrel, Claire had learned the rhythm of the base. Réveillé, the diesel cough of the generator catching each morning, the particular quiet that settled over the mess tent during the noon heat. She'd also met Sergeant Reyes, and she was starting to understand that he was going to take longer to read than the bridge had. He was waiting for her at the equipment shed when she came to inspect what the detachment actually had to work with, arms crossed, a look on his face that wasn't hostile so much as carefully unconvinced. "Captain," he nodded. "Heard you walked the bridge already." "I did. And I think your reinforcement work on the south span probably bought more time than anyone gave it credit for." She watched something shift slightly in his shoulders. Not quite surprise, but close. "I also think the crack on the second beam is worse than what's logged. I logged it myself 2 months ago. I know, I read it. I'm telling you it's grown." Reyes didn't answer right away. He led her into the shed instead and showed her what they had. A partial pallet of rebar, half a bag of concrete mix gone hard at the edges from moisture, cable that had seen better decades. "This is it," he said. "This is what I've been patching that bridge with for 8 months. You want to tell me how I'm supposed to do better than monitor only with this? I'm not here to tell you you've done it wrong, Sergeant. I've seen worse work done with better materials." That, finally, got something close to a real look from him. Not warmth, but the beginning of attention instead of suspicion. She submitted her request to Regional Supply that afternoon. Structural steel, proper concrete mix, cable rated for the load she actually needed rather than the load someone had assumed was sufficient 3 years ago when the bridge was built. She wrote it carefully, with numbers, with the corrosion measurements from the water tower attached as a second, separate flag. She knew how these requests got read, triaged against fuel convoys and ammunition resupply and a dozen other things that felt more immediately urgent than a crack in a beam that hadn't failed yet. The response came back faster than she expected and worse than she'd hoped. Request logged, priority routine, estimated fulfillment 3 to 4 weeks, contingent on convoy availability 3 to 4 weeks. She read it twice in her tent that evening, the kerosene lamp throwing long shadows across the canvas, and felt the particular cold settle in her chest that she recognized from 2 years ago. Not panic. She didn't let herself panic, but the sharp, clear awareness of a clock she couldn't control. She found Reyes the next morning going over the manifest for an upcoming resupply convoy and asked the question she already half knew the answer to. "When's the next big load scheduled to cross?" He checked the board. 9 days. Fuel, rations, medical resupply, full trucks. He looked up at her, and she watched him do the same math she'd already done, watched his face change as he got there. "That's significantly more weight than what's been crossing." "Yes." "And the bridge wasn't rated for it even before the crack grew. It might hold. It's been holding for months on a wing and a prayer in your patch jobs, and I mean that as a compliment, Sergeant, not an insult." She pulled out her notebook, the numbers she'd run twice already, and laid it flat on the crate between them. "But I'm not willing to bet a convoy on might." Reyes studied the figures for a long moment, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he didn't argue with her. He just exhaled, slow, and said what she'd already been thinking. 9 days, no materials coming for 3 weeks. So what exactly are we supposed to do? Claire looked back down at the numbers, at the gap between what she needed and what she had, and didn't have an answer yet. Just the certainty, settling in alongside the cold in her chest. That monitor only wasn't a strategy anymore. It hadn't been one for a while. It was just the thing everyone had agreed to call it. The weather turned on the 6th day, the sky over the ridgeline going the color of a fresh bruise by mid-afternoon. Claire stood outside the operations tent and watched it roll in, and felt the same cold certainty she'd been carrying since the supply request came back marked routine. She found Major Holt inside, bent over a map with two of his lieutenants, and waited for a break in the conversation that didn't come fast enough for her patience. "Sir, a word, when you have one." He glanced up, read something in her face, and dismissed the lieutenants with a nod. "Go ahead, Captain. That storm system is going to put a lot of water into this valley fast. I need you to consider rerouting or at least delaying the resupply convoy until I can get eyes on the bridge again after the rain passes." "The convoy's already behind schedule, Captain. We reroute or delay. That's fuel we don't have, rations we don't have, and a message to regional command that this base can't support its own logistics. You understand what that does to how we get prioritized going forward?" "I understand it. I also understand that a bridge with a growing crack in its support beam, under a load it wasn't rated for, crossing during or right after a flood event, is not a risk I can sign off on." "You're not being asked to sign off on it. I am." It landed exactly the way she suspected he meant it to. Not cruel, just a reminder of where the actual authorities sat, and a reminder that she was 6 days into a 6-week posting at a base that had been running fine, more or less. Before she arrived, she felt the old instinct rise in her, the one that had cost her sleep for 2 years now. Say it again, more carefully. Don't overstate it. Don't understate it either. Don't be the officer who cried wolf, and don't be the officer who stayed quiet. "Sir, I'm not trying to tell you how to run logistics. I'm telling you what the structure can and can't safely hold. And right now, I can't give you a number I trust until I see what this storm does to that riverbed." Holt held her gaze for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal either. "Get me your numbers after the rain. I'll consider it. That's what I can give you right now." It wasn't yes. It wasn't no. Claire walked back out into the wind, already feeling the first fat drops of rain on her face, and told herself it would have to be enough for now. The storm hit fully that night and didn't let up for 19 hours. Claire didn't sleep through any of it. She sat in her tent with the lamp guttering and listened to the rain hammering the canvas, and around 0300 gave up entirely and pulled on her rain gear to walk down toward the river with a flashlight, because sitting still while not knowing was worse than getting soaked finding out. The water had risen nearly 4 feet already, churning brown and fast against the bridge's support beams, throwing up spray that caught silver in her flashlight beam. She didn't try to get close. She didn't need to. She could see enough from the bank to know the current was putting lateral force on those beams that hadn't been part of anyone's original calculation, and the second beam, the cracked one, was half submerged now, the water working at it in a way that made her stomach tighten. She was still standing there when Reyes found her, his own flashlight cutting through the rain. "Captain, you're going to catch pneumonia standing out here." I needed to see it. And it's worse than I want it to be. She turned the light off, conserving the battery, and they stood for a moment in the dark and the rain, the river loud beneath them. "How bad is the access road?" "That's actually why I came to find you. Mudslide came down about a mile up the pass, right where the road cuts along the ridge. It's not getting cleared before the convoy's supposed to move. The alternate route's gone, Captain. It's the bridge or nothing." Claire closed her eyes briefly, rain running down her face, and felt the walls of the problem close in another few inches. The rain finally broke the following afternoon, and Claire spent the next 2 days barely sleeping, running calculations by lamplight with Reyes beside her more often than not. Something had shifted between them somewhere in that storm. She couldn't point to the exact moment, but she noticed it in small ways. He stopped prefacing things with Captain, with respect. He started just telling her what he thought, directly, the way he might talk to an engineer he actually trusted. "The current scoured out more bank than I expected on the east side," he told her on the second night, spreading a hand-drawn sketch across the crate between them. "That changes your load distribution, not by a lot, but it's not zero. Show me where." He did, and she adjusted her numbers, and the two of them sat there past midnight with the lamp burning low. Two people who'd started the week as near strangers now working the same problem from the same side of the table. What the numbers told her in the end wasn't good. The bridge could probably, a word she hated and couldn't avoid, hold a single vehicle at reduced speed, spaced loads, careful weight distribution. It could not hold the convoy as currently planned. Not safely, not in good conscience. She was drafting that exact assessment for Major Holt when the runner came through her tent flap, breathing hard. Rain still beaded on his jacket from a fresh drizzle. "Captain Anderson, Major wants you at operations, now." She found Holt with the radio handset still in his hand, his face harder than she'd seen it yet. "Convoy's moving in 48 hours, he said before she could speak. "No way around it now. Regional's adding 2 medical evacuees to the manifest. Soldiers from the outpost up the valley. Can't wait for the road to clear. Can't wait for a helicopter slot that isn't coming for days in this weather. They're coming through here. They're crossing that bridge." He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something other than overstretched patience in his expression. She saw a man who knew exactly how much was riding on what she said next. "Tell me what you need, Captain. Because right now, you're the only thing standing between that convoy and a bridge I'm not sure can hold it." Claire didn't sleep that night either, but for the first time in days, it wasn't from worry alone. Somewhere around 0100, staring at her sketches by lamplight, an idea had started forming. Rough at first, then sharper as she worked through it. She found Reyes before dawn, already up, already at the equipment shed like he'd known she'd come. "I think I have something," she said, and spread her notebook open on the workbench. "We can't get the bridge back to full rated capacity in 48 hours. Not with what we have. But I think we can buy enough margin for one careful crossing if we redistribute the load differently than the deck was ever designed to carry." She walked him through it, a temporary rig using the cable they had, old but rated higher than she needed for this, anchored above the weakest span, running tension up and over a support frame they'd built from what timber and rebar remained, taking weight off the cracked beam and transferring it sideways into the stronger sections of the structure. Not a permanent fix, not even close. A sling, essentially, for a bridge that needed to hold for one morning. Reyes studied the sketch for a long moment, running his finger along the lines of her design the way she imagined he'd once run his hands over the bridge itself, searching for the place it might fail. "This isn't in any manual I've ever seen." "No, it's not." She held his gaze. "I can't give you a regulation that backs this up, Sergeant. I can give you the math, and I can tell you I'd stand on it myself before I'd ask anyone else to." He looked at her for another moment, and then nodded once, slow. "Then let's build it." She brought the plan to Major Holt an hour later, laying it out plainly. What it could do, what it couldn't, and the fact that it was untested, designed in a single night by an engineer 6 days into her posting at his base. Holt listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he didn't answer right away. He looked at her sketch, then at her. "You're telling me this is the best option you've got. I'm telling you it's the only option I've got that doesn't mean turning that convoy back and leaving 2 wounded soldiers waiting on a road that isn't clearing anytime soon. And if you're wrong?" She didn't flinch from it, even though the question landed somewhere old and tender. "Then I'm wrong, and people could get hurt, and that's on me. I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make this easier to say yes to." Holt was quiet for a long moment. Then he set the sketch down. "It's your call, Captain. Your design, your assessment, your crossing. I'll back whatever you decide, but I'm not making this one for you. You're the engineer. This is what Command sent you here to do." It wasn't the answer she'd braced for. Part of her had wanted him to simply order it, to take the weight of the decision somewhere else. Instead, it sat fully in her hands, the way, she realized, standing there, it probably always had. "Then we build it," she said. They worked through the day and into the night, 12 soldiers under Reyes's direction, hauling timber and threading cable under floodlights run off the generator Claire had flagged for replacement a week earlier, and which, by some mercy, held. She worked alongside them, hands raw from cable, voice gone hoarse from shouting measurements over the noise of the river still running high below. Near midnight, they tested the rig under partial load, a single empty truck moving slow, while Claire stood at the anchor point watching the tension gauge she'd rigged from spare parts. The cable held for the first 30 feet. Then the anchor bolt on the upstream side gave a sharp crack and shifted, the whole rig lurching half an inch before Reyes's shout brought the truck to a stop just short of the weak span. For one long second, Claire's chest went entirely cold, not at what had happened, but at what had nearly happened. The ghost of a training facility 2 years gone rising up fast and unwelcome. Then the second passed, and the engineer in her took back over from the fear. "It's the anchor point, not the cable," she said, already crouching to examine it, voice steadier than she felt. "We overtrusted the rock face here. We need to redistribute into 2 anchor points instead of 1, here and here." She was sketching even as she spoke. Reyes crouched beside her with a fresh stake already in hand. They rebuilt the anchor system in the dark, working until almost 0300, and tested it again at first light. This time the gauge held steady as the truck crossed, the rig taking the strain exactly the way her revised numbers said it should. The convoy crossed at dawn, vehicle by vehicle, spaced and slow, exactly as Claire had specified. She stood at the critical point on the span with the tension gauge in hand and Reyes at the anchor, calling numbers back and forth between them as each truck inched across the boards. The medical vehicle came last, carrying the 2 wounded soldiers from the outpost up the valley, moving at a crawl that felt, to Claire, like it stretched on for an hour rather than the 90 seconds it actually took. She watched the gauge. She watched the cable. She watched the water still running fast and brown beneath the span, and didn't let herself breathe properly until the vehicle's back wheels cleared the far bank and rolled onto solid ground. Only then did she let the breath go, all at once, her hands unsteady on the gauge for the first time since the work had started. Beside her, Reyes exhaled the same way, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, just stood there in the gray morning light, the bridge holding beneath them, the convoy safe on the other side. The materials arrived 6 days later, a flatbed truck loaded with structural steel, proper concrete mix, cable rated for loads that would make the temporary rig look like the improvisation it always had been. Claire watched it roll across the bridge slowly, the same way every vehicle had crossed since the storm, and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't fully realized she'd been holding on to. The bridge took the weight without complaint. It had earned that, she thought. So had the people who'd built the rig that got them through the days before this truck could come. The real repair took 11 days. Claire oversaw it from the first morning, but she didn't stand back and direct from a clipboard the way she might have at the start of her posting. She worked the site herself, mixing concrete, threading rebar, checking welds with the same care she'd given the original assessment, because she'd learned by now that the work didn't get easier just because help had finally arrived. If anything, doing it right mattered more now. This wasn't a temporary sling meant to hold for one careful crossing. This needed to last. Reyes worked beside her every day of it, and the dynamic between them had settled into something neither suspicion nor deference. Just 2 engineers, one with a commission and one without, who'd stopped needing to establish which was which. On the 4th day, he handed her a thermos of coffee without being asked, the kind of small gesture that meant more from him than it would have from someone who hadn't spent a night with her wrist deep in cable, listening to an anchor bolt crack in the dark. "You know," he said, watching her check a weld with a critical eye, "when they told us an engineer was coming out from Core, I figured it'd be someone who'd read about bridges, not someone who'd build one with us at 3 in the morning. I had a feeling that's what you figured. Wasn't trying to insult you, Captain. I know." She straightened up, wiping concrete dust from her hands onto her pants, already a lost cause. I've met enough of the other kind to understand why you'd assume it." He almost smiled at that, the closest she'd seen yet, and went back to his work, and she went back to hers. And that was the whole exchange. It didn't need to be more than that. Some respect didn't announce itself. It just showed up quietly, in coffee handed over without asking, in a sergeant who no longer prefaced his opinions with respect, Captain, because he'd stopped needing the cushion. Major Holt found her on the bridge on the second-to-last day of repairs, standing at the spot where the temporary rig had once strained against a failing anchor point, now reinforced with steel that wouldn't need to be trusted blind the way that cable had. "Regional's asking for an after-action report," he said. "Wants to know how a captain 6 days into a posting ended up redesigning load distribution on an active supply route during a flood event. I imagine they want to know whether to be worried about it happening again." Something like that. He looked out over the water, calmer now, running clear instead of brown. "I told them what I saw. Engineer made a call under pressure, owned the risk fully, didn't ask anyone else to carry what she wasn't willing to carry herself. Said it worked because she didn't pretend it was a sure thing. She just made it the most certain thing she could, and then she stood on it." He glanced sideways at her. "Wasn't sure what to expect when you stepped off that helicopter, Captain. A lot of people come through here who look good on paper and fold the first time the paper doesn't match the ground. And now? Now I'm glad Regional sent you instead of someone who'd have signed off on monitor only and gone home in 6 weeks without losing sleep over it." He said it plainly, the way he said most things, but it landed with more weight than a more elaborate compliment would have. Then he nodded once, the closest thing to ceremony the moment was going to get, and left her there on the bridge. That night, in her tent, Claire wrote a letter she didn't entirely know how to address. Not quite to Davis, the soldier whose broken leg had haunted 2 years of her career, and not quite to herself either. She wrote about the bridge, about the anchor bolt that had cracked under partial load, and the half-second of pure cold fear that had followed it. Fear that had nothing to do with the bridge and everything to do with a training facility a world away. She wrote that the fear hadn't stopped her from finishing the calculation, that maybe it never would stop her, not fully, and that she'd come to understand, somewhere in the middle of a flooded night with cable cutting into her palms, that this wasn't a flaw to fix. It was the thing that made her check twice, the thing that made her trust a number only after she'd tried to break it herself, on paper, before she ever let it carry a soldier's weight. She didn't send the letter anywhere. She folded it and put it in her notebook, beside the calculations from the bridge, and let it sit there as something closer to a private accounting than a message meant for anyone else to read. On her last morning at Kestrel, before the helicopter that would carry her to her next assignment, Claire walked the bridge one final time. The new steel gleamed slightly in the early light, not yet weathered into the rest of the structure the way it eventually would be. The river ran low and ordinary beneath her boots, almost unrecognizable as the same water that had nearly taken a truck and 2 wounded soldiers down with it less than 2 weeks before. Reyes fell into step beside her without being asked, the way he might have for any routine inspection now, the suspicion of that first week entirely gone. "Held up pretty well," he said, nodding at the repair. "It should. We built it right this time." "Yeah." He glanced sideways at her. "We did." They walked the rest of the span without talking, the base behind them a little sturdier than the place Claire had landed in 6 weeks earlier. The water tower repaired, the generator replaced, the bridge rebuilt with materials that would actually hold what came across it. She thought, watching the river slide by beneath the new steel, that the base wasn't the only thing standing a little steadier than it had been. She felt it too, in some quiet, structural way she didn't have a clean formula for, the difference between a person who carried doubt as a weight and one who'd finally learned to build with it instead. The helicopter was waiting when she reached the pad. She didn't look back at the bridge again before she climbed aboard. She didn't need to. She already knew, with the same certainty she trusted in every number she signed her name to, that it would hold. And now, dear viewers, thank you for watching this story to the very end. If Claire's story moved you, give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you in the next story.